Long before Orochimaru became one of the most feared figures in the shinobi world, before he created hidden laboratories and experimented on countless human beings, he was simply a gifted young shinobi who could not accept one of the most basic realities of human existence. People die. From an early age, Orochimaru was confronted with the loss of his parents, and their graves became a permanent reminder of something he could neither understand nor control. While most people eventually accept death as an unavoidable part of life, Orochimaru became increasingly fascinated by the possibility that death might not actually be inevitable if the secrets of the human body could be understood completely. That fascination developed during his years under Hiruzen Sarutobi, who recognized Orochimaru as an exceptionally intelligent and talented student. Alongside Jiraiya and Tsunade, Orochimaru eventually became one of the legendary Sannin, fighting during the Second Great Ninja War and earning a reputation as one of Konoha's most dangerous and capable shinobi. Yet while his abilities in battle continued to grow, his greatest interest was never simply becoming stronger than his opponents. Orochimaru wanted knowledge, and unlike most shinobi, he possessed very few limits regarding how far he was willing to go in order to obtain it. He studied ninjutsu, chakra, bloodlines, forbidden techniques, and the unusual abilities possessed by different clans, constantly searching for answers to questions that most people never thought to ask. Why could some individuals manipulate particular elements while others could not? Why were certain abilities passed through bloodlines? Why did the human body age? Could physical abilities be transferred from one person to another? Could consciousness survive after the body itself had deteriorated? These questions gradually became more important to Orochimaru than the ordinary goals of a shinobi. And the more answers he discovered, the more questions seemed to appear. The death of his parents remained an important part of this transformation, because Orochimaru did not simply fear dying himself. He became obsessed with the enormous amount of knowledge that was lost whenever a person died. Every shinobi carried experiences that could never be perfectly passed on to another generation. And every unique bloodline represented a biological possibility that could disappear forever. To Orochimaru, mortality was therefore not merely a personal tragedy. It was an obstacle standing between humanity and unlimited knowledge. The Second Great Ninja War gave him plenty of reasons to think about that problem. Orochimaru witnessed countless young shinobi die before they had reached their full potential, while powerful techniques and valuable knowledge disappeared alongside them. Even the strongest warriors were eventually reduced to corpses, leaving behind only memories and stories. Orochimaru gradually became convinced that the greatest weakness of humanity was not a lack of power, but the short amount of time each person was given to acquire and preserve knowledge. If one person could live indefinitely, that person could theoretically learn everything. This idea became the foundation of his obsession with immortality. At first, Orochimaru's research could still be described as scientific curiosity, but his methods gradually crossed boundaries that even Konoha could not tolerate. He began experimenting with the human body in order to understand how it responded to unusual forms of chakra manipulation, how different genetic traits functioned, and whether the characteristics of one individual could somehow be incorporated into another. The human body was no longer simply something he wanted to understand. It became the laboratory. Orochimaru's greatest advantage was his intelligence. He did not conduct experiments randomly, because almost everything he did was designed to answer a specific question. If a subject possessed an unusual ability, Orochimaru wanted to understand where that ability came from. If a body reacted differently to a particular technique, he wanted to know why. If an experiment failed, the failure itself became information that could be used to improve the next attempt. This way of thinking gradually destroyed the distinction between scientific research and cruelty. A person could no longer simply be a person in Orochimaru's eyes. They could become a bloodline, a chakra system, a genetic trait, or a potential vessel. Their identity mattered less than what their body could teach him. Once that mindset became normal to him, experiments that would have horrified ordinary shinobi could be rationalized as necessary steps toward a greater discovery. His research into immortality became increasingly connected to this philosophy. Orochimaru understood that even if he mastered every ninjutsu in existence, his own body would eventually age and die. He could spend decades studying the mysteries of the shinobi world and still lose everything once his life ended. Rather than accepting that limitation, he began searching for a method that would allow his consciousness to survive beyond the natural lifespan of a single body. This eventually led to the development of the living corpse reincarnation technique. The concept was horrifyingly simple in its purpose. Orochimaru would transfer his consciousness into another person's body, effectively abandoning his old body and continuing his existence through a new vessel. In theory, this allowed him to escape aging, while simultaneously giving him access to bodies with different physical characteristics and abilities. But the technique could not simply be invented through imagination. Orochimaru needed to understand how consciousness interacted with another body, how chakra systems adapted to the transfer, and which bodies could successfully sustain him. He needed subjects, and he needed them repeatedly. This created an enormous demand for people possessing unusual physical traits, powerful bloodlines, or bodies that might provide useful information. The more valuable a body was, the more interested Orochimaru became. One of the most significant examples of this obsession involved the pursuit of powerful bloodline abilities. Orochimaru understood that certain clans possessed abilities that could not be reproduced through ordinary training, meaning that the secrets of those bloodlines were potentially more valuable than any conventional ninjutsu. Instead of simply studying these abilities from a distance, he wanted to understand them from within the body itself. This would eventually lead him toward experiments involving the genetic material of some of the most powerful shinobi in history. Hiruzen eventually discovered what his former student had been doing. For Hiruzen, the revelation was particularly painful because Orochimaru had once represented the possibility of becoming one of Konoha's greatest leaders. His intelligence, talent, and natural ability had made him an obvious candidate for the future of the village. Yet those same qualities had taken him somewhere Hiruzen could no longer follow. Hiruzen confronted him and attempted to stop his research, but Orochimaru refused to abandon the path he had chosen. He escaped Konoha and became a missing nin. Ironically, leaving the village gave Orochimaru exactly what he needed. Without Konoha's laws restricting his research, without Hiruzen monitoring his actions, and without having to answer to anyone who objected to his methods, Orochimaru could build laboratories wherever he wanted and conduct experiments without fear of discovery. His research expanded far beyond immortality, eventually covering genetic modification, artificial life, forbidden transformations, reincarnation, bloodline abilities, and the creation of beings who could serve as tools for his experiments. What had begun with the grief of a child who could not accept the death of his parents had become something much larger. Orochimaru no longer wanted simply to avoid death. He wanted to understand life so completely that death itself would become nothing more than another problem to solve. And once he began viewing human beings as material for that research, there was almost no boundary he was unwilling to cross in pursuit of the answer. After Orochimaru abandoned Konoha, his research entered a completely different stage, because exile removed the final restraints that had limited what he was willing to do in pursuit of knowledge. He no longer had to hide his work from Hiruzen Sarutobi, follow the laws of the village, or pretend that his experiments were merely theoretical studies. With access to hidden laboratories and a growing network of followers, Orochimaru could finally investigate the questions that had occupied his mind for years. And the human body became the center of nearly all of his research. One of his earliest and most important discoveries was that the human body could potentially be altered far beyond its natural limitations. The shinobi world already contained countless examples of people possessing extraordinary physical characteristics. But Orochimaru wanted to understand whether those traits could be deliberately reproduced. Bloodline limits such as the Sharingan, wood release, and other Kekkei Genkai were generally treated as abilities inherited through specific families, meaning that ordinary shinobi could never simply learn them through training. To Orochimaru, however, that limitation was not an absolute rule. It was a scientific problem waiting to be solved. His experiments increasingly focused on genetics. Rather than accepting that certain abilities belonged exclusively to particular bloodlines, Orochimaru began investigating whether genetic material from powerful individuals could be introduced into other bodies. If successful, such research could potentially allow someone without a particular bloodline to acquire its abilities, creating possibilities that would have enormous consequences for the shinobi world. This interest eventually brought him into contact with the legacy of the first Hokage. Hashirama Senju had been dead for decades, yet his body remained one of the most valuable biological resources imaginable. Hashirama possessed wood release, an ability so rare and powerful that almost nobody else in history had ever demonstrated it naturally. He had also possessed extraordinary vitality and a chakra reserve that allowed him to perform techniques on a scale that even the strongest shinobi struggled to comprehend. Orochimaru became determined to reproduce those qualities. His experiments involved implanting Hashirama's cells into living subjects, hoping that another person's body might accept the genetic material and develop wood release. The process was extraordinarily dangerous because the cells were highly aggressive and difficult for ordinary bodies to tolerate. Most of the subjects died as a result. 100 children were eventually used in the experiments. Only one survived. That child was Yamato. At the time, Yamato was known simply as a test subject, having been taken from his family while still very young and subjected to Orochimaru's experiments without understanding what was being done to him. Somehow, his body successfully adapted to Hashirama's cells, allowing him to develop wood release and making him the only known survivor of Orochimaru's original experiment. The survival rate revealed just how extreme the research had been. Orochimaru had effectively treated 100 children as disposable test cases in order to determine whether Hashirama's genetic abilities could be reproduced. 99 died, while the single survivor became proof that the experiment could work. The consequences of that discovery were enormous. Years later, Yamato's wood release would become incredibly valuable to Konoha because it gave him the ability to suppress the chakra of the Nine Tails. This made him particularly important after Naruto Uzumaki became a Jinchuriki capable of losing control over the beast's power. Ironically, the same experiment that had nearly killed Yamato ultimately gave him an ability that helped protect the village Orochimaru had once betrayed. But the Hashirama experiments were only one part of Orochimaru's larger research program. He was also fascinated by the possibility of creating artificial life. Rather than simply modifying existing humans, Orochimaru wanted to understand whether living organisms could be produced, altered, and controlled through scientific methods. His laboratories became places where biology and ninjutsu overlapped, with bodies being modified through techniques that blurred the boundary between medicine and forbidden experimentation. This research would eventually contribute to the creation of numerous artificial beings and modified organisms. Some experiments were designed to test physical strength, while others explored regeneration, chakra capacity, or compatibility with unusual abilities. Orochimaru constantly searched for bodies that could survive transformations that ordinary humans could not tolerate. The more successful an experiment became, the more ambitious the next one could be. His work also led him toward the study of cloning. If a particular body possessed valuable genetic characteristics, then reproducing that genetic material could theoretically eliminate the need to repeatedly search for suitable subjects. Orochimaru could create organisms possessing specific traits and then observe how those traits developed. This approach would eventually become important in his experiments involving the first Hokage and other powerful shinobi. Yet Orochimaru's greatest obsession remained immortality. Every experiment ultimately connected back to the same goal. He wanted a body that could survive indefinitely. The living corpse. Reincarnation technique was therefore not an isolated invention, but the product of years of research into human biology, chakra, consciousness, and genetic compatibility. Orochimaru discovered that simply transferring his consciousness was not enough. The new body had to accept him, remain healthy, and withstand the immense strain caused by his techniques. This created another problem. Bodies deteriorated. Even if Orochimaru successfully transferred himself into a new vessel, that body would eventually begin rejecting his presence. The technique could extend his life, but it could not make a single vessel permanent. He therefore needed to continue searching for better bodies, especially those possessing powerful bloodlines or unusual physical characteristics. This was one of the reasons Orochimaru became so interested in Sasuke Uchiha. The Sharingan represented one of the greatest bloodline abilities in the shinobi world, and Orochimaru understood that possessing an Uchiha body would provide enormous advantages. He did not simply want the Sharingan itself. He wanted the body that naturally possessed it, because that would allow him to use the bloodline without the limitations faced by someone who had acquired the eyes artificially. Sasuke, therefore, became more than a student. He became a future vessel. Orochimaru's decision to approach Sasuke demonstrated how his experiments had changed his relationship with other people. He could still teach, encourage, and manipulate individuals. But beneath those interactions, he was constantly evaluating their potential as experimental subjects or future bodies. Kabuto Yakushi became another important example of this philosophy, eventually serving as both assistant and researcher, while helping Orochimaru gather information from across the shinobi world. Kabuto's medical expertise made him particularly useful. Together, they were able to study bodies, bloodlines, and biological transformations at a level that few other shinobi could match. Orochimaru provided the ambition and forbidden knowledge, while Kabuto increasingly became capable of conducting sophisticated medical and genetic research himself. Yet the more Orochimaru discovered, the more dangerous his work became. The experiments involving Hashirama's cells demonstrated that an individual's body could potentially acquire abilities that were never naturally theirs. The research into immortality demonstrated that consciousness could be transferred between bodies. The study of bloodlines suggested that genetic abilities might be reproduced or combined. Each discovery opened another door, and Orochimaru had no intention of stopping at the first successful result. He wanted everything, every bloodline, every technique, every form of life, every secret. And most importantly, he wanted enough time to learn them all. The hidden laboratories scattered throughout the shinobi world became monuments to that obsession. Behind their walls were the results of years of research, countless failed experiments, preserved bodies, altered organisms, and subjects whose lives had been reduced to data. To Orochimaru, however, none of this represented cruelty for its own sake. It represented progress. That was precisely what made him so dangerous, because he had convinced himself that the value of knowledge could justify almost any price required to obtain it. By the time Orochimaru's experiments had expanded beyond simple biological research, he had already discovered that the human body could be manipulated in ways that most shinobi considered impossible. Hashirama's cells had shown him that genetic traits could potentially be transferred between individuals, while his research into immortality had demonstrated that consciousness could survive through the replacement of the body itself. Yet Orochimaru still faced one fundamental problem. Even if he could change bodies, he needed to understand how to make those bodies stronger, more compatible, and capable of containing powers far beyond their natural limits. His answer was the curse mark. The curse mark was not simply a technique designed to make an ordinary shinobi stronger. It was the result of Orochimaru's research into Jugo's unique ability to naturally absorb and transform surrounding energy. Jugo belonged to a clan whose bodies could instinctively absorb natural energy, allowing them to enter powerful transformations without the deliberate training normally required to access Sage Mode. The ability was incredibly dangerous, however, because Jugo could lose control of his emotions and physical form whenever the energy overwhelmed him. Orochimaru saw something else. He saw potential. If Jugo's ability could be isolated and transferred into other bodies, Orochimaru could potentially create a system that allowed ordinary shinobi to access enormous amounts of power without requiring the years of training normally necessary to master natural energy. More importantly, the process could provide him with another way to test the limits of human bodies and determine which individuals were capable of surviving increasingly extreme transformations. The result was the creation of the curse mark. Orochimaru developed multiple versions of the seal, each designed to inject a modified form of Jugo's enzymes into a subject's body. The process was extraordinarily dangerous, and most people who received the mark died almost immediately. Only a small percentage survived the implantation, meaning that, once again, Orochimaru was effectively using human beings as test subjects to determine which bodies were compatible with his research. Those who survived gained access to a powerful new source of strength. The curse mark could initially appear as dark markings spreading across the body, but when activated, it dramatically altered the user's physical appearance and increased their chakra and physical abilities. The transformation could progress further into a second stage, producing an even more extreme physical mutation and granting the user a tremendous increase in power. But the curse mark came with a hidden cost. The seal was not simply a source of power. It was a connection to Orochimaru. By placing his chakra and modified biological material inside another person, Orochimaru could influence the subject and maintain a form of control over them. The seal therefore served two purposes simultaneously. It allowed Orochimaru to study how different bodies responded to Jugo's power, while also creating a network of potential vessels and followers who carried a fragment of his influence. The curse mark experiments produced many subjects, but only a few became particularly important. One of them was Anko Mitarashi. Anko had once been Orochimaru's student during his years in Konoha, and she became one of the earliest known survivors of his curse mark experiments. Unlike Sasuke, she was never intended to become his primary vessel, but her existence demonstrated that the seal could be successfully implanted into another human being. After Orochimaru abandoned her, Anko retained the mark for years, carrying a permanent reminder of the experiments she had survived. Her relationship with Orochimaru also revealed something important about his research. He did not necessarily discard every successful subject immediately. Some were left alive because they could provide information later, while others could serve as proof that a technique worked. Anko became both a survivor and a living piece of evidence of Orochimaru's experimentation, even though she eventually turned against the person who had marked her. The curse mark became far more important when Orochimaru encountered Sasuke Uchiha. Sasuke possessed everything Orochimaru desired in a potential vessel. He was young, physically talented, possessed an extraordinary chakra system, and carried the bloodline of the Uchiha clan. Most importantly, his Sharingan had the potential to develop into abilities that could rival the strongest bloodline techniques in the shinobi world. Orochimaru wanted Sasuke's body, but he knew that Sasuke would never willingly surrender it. The solution was manipulation. During the Chunin exams, Orochimaru infiltrated the Forest of Death and deliberately targeted Sasuke, recognizing that the young Uchiha's desire for power made him particularly vulnerable. Orochimaru attacked him and placed the curse mark directly onto his neck, knowing that the seal would provide Sasuke with immense power while also gradually influencing him. The result was almost immediate. Sasuke's strength increased dramatically, but so did the danger surrounding him. The curse mark occasionally activated without his full control, spreading across his body and pushing him toward a more violent state of mind. Orochimaru had effectively given Sasuke exactly what he wanted, while ensuring that the power came with a connection to the person who had provided it. This became one of Orochimaru's most effective methods of recruitment. He did not need to force every subject to obey him. He could offer them power. For ambitious shinobi, that power was often enough to make them willing to follow him voluntarily. The curse mark therefore functioned as both an experiment and a psychological weapon. Orochimaru could identify individuals willing to risk their bodies for greater strength, study their reactions to the seal, and then use their dependence upon that power to maintain control over them. Sasuke became the greatest example. After leaving Konoha, Sasuke eventually traveled to Orochimaru's hidden base, believing that the missing nin could provide the strength he needed to defeat Itachi. Orochimaru welcomed him because the arrangement served both of their goals. Sasuke wanted power, while Orochimaru wanted a powerful future vessel. For several years, Orochimaru trained Sasuke while secretly preparing to take control of his body. Everything about their relationship therefore contained a hidden contradiction. Sasuke believed he was using Orochimaru to become stronger, while Orochimaru believed he was patiently preparing Sasuke to become his next body. Both were manipulating each other, and both believed they would eventually be the one who came out on top. The curse mark was central to this relationship because it represented Orochimaru's entire philosophy in miniature. Power could be created through experimentation. Bodies could be altered. Natural limitations could be overcome. And people could be turned into vessels for someone else's ambitions. Yet the curse mark also demonstrated one of the greatest weaknesses in Orochimaru's approach. He could manipulate bodies, but he could never completely control the will of the people inside them. Sasuke eventually became strong enough to resist him, and when Orochimaru finally attempted to take Sasuke's body, the young Uchiha turned the technique against its creator and absorbed him instead. For Orochimaru, defeat was temporary. His consciousness survived within Sasuke's body and later returned through another method, proving that even when one experiment failed, he had already prepared alternatives. This was what made Orochimaru's research so difficult to destroy. His experiments were not isolated projects. They were connected. The curse mark led to research into Jugo's abilities, which connected to sage transformations, which connected to Orochimaru's studies of biological compatibility, which connected to his search for better vessels, which ultimately connected back to his obsession with immortality. Every experiment created another piece of the same puzzle, and Orochimaru was still searching for the perfect body. Orochimaru's fascination with the human body was never limited to immortality itself, because he understood that the greatest secrets of the shinobi world were often hidden within bloodlines that could not be reproduced through ordinary training. Certain clans possessed abilities that seemed almost impossible to explain through conventional ninjutsu. And among all of them, none fascinated Orochimaru more than the Uchiha. Their Sharingan allowed its users to perceive and copy techniques, anticipate movements, and eventually develop increasingly powerful abilities that could completely transform a battle. To Orochimaru, the Sharingan represented far more than a powerful weapon. It represented a biological mystery. He wanted to understand exactly what made the Uchiha different, why their eyes evolved in response to intense emotional experiences, and whether their abilities could somehow be separated from the individuals who naturally possessed them. His research therefore moved beyond simply studying the Sharingan and toward finding ways to obtain Uchiha genetic material for himself. This obsession became particularly important after Orochimaru began working alongside Konoha's intelligence and medical researchers, where he gained access to knowledge about the bodies of powerful shinobi. The more he learned about bloodline abilities, the more convinced he became that the human body could be redesigned to possess characteristics that had previously been considered exclusive to particular clans. His experiments with Hashirama's cells had already provided proof that this was possible. Hashirama's wood release could be transferred into another individual under extremely rare circumstances, meaning that genetic abilities were not necessarily locked permanently within a single bloodline. Orochimaru began looking at other Kekkei Genkai with the same question in mind. If one person's body could acquire another person's abilities, how far could the process eventually be pushed? The answer led him toward increasingly dangerous experiments. Orochimaru collected biological samples from powerful shinobi and experimented with methods of integrating foreign genetic material into human bodies. Some subjects were chosen because of their bloodlines, while others were selected because their bodies appeared unusually resistant to rejection. The results were inconsistent, and many experiments failed. But every failure gave Orochimaru another piece of information about compatibility. This research eventually became connected to one of his most disturbing facilities. Beneath his hidden laboratories, Orochimaru maintained numerous bodies and preserved specimens, allowing him to compare physical characteristics and study how different forms of chakra interacted with different biological structures. The laboratories were filled with scrolls, equipment, preserved materials, and the remains of previous experiments, creating an environment where human beings were treated less like people and more like biological components. His obsession with the Uchiha became even stronger after he witnessed the abilities of Itachi Uchiha. Itachi possessed one of the most advanced Sharingan in the world, and Orochimaru quickly recognized that an Uchiha body could provide him with access to abilities that were otherwise impossible to reproduce through conventional training. Orochimaru eventually joined the Akatsuki and was partnered with Itachi, giving him an opportunity to observe the Uchiha closely. For Orochimaru, however, observation was never enough. He eventually attempted to take Itachi's body. The result was disastrous. Itachi's Sharingan was powerful enough to trap Orochimaru within a genjutsu almost instantly, leaving him completely helpless. Orochimaru realized that he could not overpower Itachi and abandoned the attempt, eventually leaving the Akatsuki after understanding that Itachi's body was beyond his reach. The defeat did not eliminate his interest in the Uchiha. It simply changed his target. Sasuke became the next possibility. Unlike Itachi, Sasuke was still young, and Orochimaru believed that with enough time, he could manipulate him into becoming the perfect vessel. Sasuke possessed the Sharingan, extraordinary physical potential, and an intense desire for power created by the destruction of his clan. Orochimaru understood that this emotional vulnerability could be exploited. He therefore offered Sasuke exactly what the young Uchiha wanted: power. During the Chunin exams, Orochimaru placed the curse mark on Sasuke, knowing that the transformation would increase his abilities, while also creating a psychological connection between them. Later, Orochimaru encouraged Sasuke to leave Konoha and seek him out, promising that his training could provide the strength necessary to defeat Itachi. The arrangement was never truly about teaching. Orochimaru was preparing a vessel. His plan was to eventually perform the living corpse reincarnation technique and transfer his consciousness into Sasuke's body, allowing him to obtain the Sharingan and potentially continue his research through one of the most powerful bloodlines in existence. For years, Orochimaru patiently waited. He trained Sasuke, observed his development, and allowed the young Uchiha to become increasingly powerful. At the same time, he continued experimenting with other bodies and techniques, ensuring that he would have alternatives if Sasuke proved unsuitable. The irony was that Sasuke understood only part of the arrangement. He knew Orochimaru wanted his body, but he believed he could tolerate the risk because the power he gained would eventually allow him to achieve his goal. Sasuke therefore remained with Orochimaru because he believed he was using the older shinobi just as much as Orochimaru was using him. Eventually, that calculation proved correct. when Orochimaru's body began deteriorating, and he attempted to take Sasuke's body. Sasuke resisted. Rather than becoming Orochimaru's next vessel, he defeated him and absorbed his chakra into himself. The experiment that Orochimaru had spent years preparing ultimately became another example of his inability to completely control the people he manipulated. Yet Orochimaru's research continued. Even his defeat demonstrated something valuable to him. His consciousness had survived. His techniques had worked to a degree, and the information gathered through years of experimentation remained available. Orochimaru could lose a body without necessarily losing everything he had learned. This was the central advantage of his approach. He treated every experiment as part of a larger process. A failed subject could reveal information about genetic rejection. A successful subject could demonstrate compatibility. A powerful bloodline could provide a new direction for research. Even an enemy could become a source of biological material or knowledge. Nothing was completely wasted if Orochimaru could extract information from it. This mentality also explains his interest in combining different bloodlines. If one body could possess Hashirama's cells, and another could contain the abilities of a different clan, Orochimaru naturally wondered whether multiple traits could eventually exist within the same individual. The possibility of combining abilities that had evolved separately over generations opened an entirely new field of experimentation. He was no longer simply searching for immortality. He was attempting to overcome the biological limitations that defined every human being. Bloodlines, physical limitations, aging, disease, and even death itself were all obstacles that Orochimaru believed could eventually be solved through enough research. The problem was that every solution required another experiment, and every experiment demanded another subject. That cycle could continue indefinitely. And as Orochimaru's research expanded, the number of people caught inside that cycle increased with it. As Orochimaru's research expanded, his experiments became too numerous and too dangerous to be conducted in a single location. He began establishing hidden laboratories throughout the shinobi world, each designed to serve a different purpose within his larger pursuit of immortality and biological perfection. These facilities allowed him to operate outside the authority of the major villages, while also giving him places where human subjects, genetic samples, forbidden scrolls, and experimental organisms could be kept far from anyone who might question what was happening inside. The laboratories became the physical representation of Orochimaru's philosophy. Nothing inside them existed simply for its own sake. Bodies were preserved because they contained useful information. Scrolls were collected because they described techniques that might expand his research. Prisoners were kept because their bloodlines or physical characteristics could potentially provide new discoveries. Even animals became part of his experiments when their abilities could help him understand regeneration, transformation, or biological adaptation. Orochimaru was not interested in creating one perfect experiment. He wanted to understand every possible variation. One of the most important areas of this research involved artificial bodies and modified organisms. Orochimaru understood that his search for immortality depended upon finding bodies capable of accepting his consciousness. But he also realized that naturally occurring human bodies had limitations. If those limitations could be altered artificially, he could potentially create vessels specifically designed to withstand his techniques. This idea eventually contributed to his research involving clones. The most famous result was Mitsuki, although his creation occurred much later than many of Orochimaru's earlier experiments. Mitsuki demonstrated how far Orochimaru's research into artificial life had eventually progressed, because, unlike a normal child, Mitsuki was deliberately created through scientific experimentation rather than born naturally. His body was designed to possess extraordinary physical potential and an unusual connection to sage mode. Yet Mitsuki was not the beginning of Orochimaru's work. He was the product of decades of previous failures and discoveries. Orochimaru had spent years studying how bodies developed, how chakra interacted with biological systems, and how genetic traits could be reproduced. His earlier experiments with Hashirama's cells and other bloodlines had provided information that eventually allowed him to become far more sophisticated in his ability to manipulate living organisms. The most disturbing aspect of this research was the fact that Orochimaru often viewed the difference between creating a person and modifying one as almost meaningless. If a body could be grown artificially, then it could be designed according to specific requirements. If genetic traits could be inserted into that body, then abilities could potentially be selected before the organism ever developed. If the resulting creature could be trained or conditioned, Orochimaru could theoretically create beings specifically suited for particular purposes. This was no longer ordinary shinobi experimentation. It was the beginning of biological engineering. Orochimaru's experiments also involved the creation of modified soldiers and test subjects who could survive transformations that normal humans could not. His curse. Mark research was one example, but it was far from the only one. He wanted to determine how far a body could be pushed before it failed, and whether that failure could be prevented through genetic modification or medical intervention. Many subjects did not survive. Those who did became evidence that the process could work. One of the clearest examples was the group of test subjects who received Hashirama's cells. Nearly every child involved in the experiment died, but Yamato survived and acquired wood release. From Orochimaru's perspective, the experiment was therefore technically successful, despite the enormous human cost. That way of thinking was central to his research. He measured success through results rather than consequences. The suffering of 99 dead children could be acknowledged as tragic, but it did not make the experiment scientifically useless, because the one survivor demonstrated that the process was possible. Once Orochimaru discovered a successful result, he could refine the method and attempt it again with greater precision. This mentality made his laboratories extremely dangerous. A normal scientist might abandon an experiment after repeated failures because the risks had become unacceptable. Orochimaru did the opposite. Failure simply encouraged him to modify the process and try again. Every unsuccessful subject narrowed the range of possibilities until eventually he could identify the conditions required for survival. His research into the first Hokage's cells also connected with his interest in the artificial production of powerful shinobi. Hashirama's abilities represented one of the greatest examples of biological potential in the shinobi world. And Orochimaru wanted to understand whether that potential could be reproduced artificially. If it could, then the abilities of legendary individuals would no longer have to disappear when they died. This idea connected directly to Orochimaru's original fear of mortality. He hated the fact that people died because death took knowledge with them. By reproducing their abilities artificially, he could preserve at least part of what they had been. In his mind, experimentation could therefore be justified as a method of reserving knowledge that would otherwise disappear. The irony was that his methods often destroyed the very humanity he claimed to be preserving. This contradiction became increasingly obvious as Orochimaru's experiments progressed. He wanted to preserve the abilities of human beings, yet he repeatedly destroyed the lives of ordinary people in order to achieve that goal. He wanted to understand life, yet he treated living subjects as disposable resources. He wanted to defeat death, yet his research created countless deaths along the way. Orochimaru rarely acknowledged this contradiction. To him, the final discovery mattered more than the individual costs required to reach it. His laboratories also became increasingly connected to the people who served him. Kabuto Yakushi eventually became his most important assistant, combining medical expertise with Orochimaru's forbidden research. Kabuto learned how to analyze bodies, modify biological material, and reproduce techniques that Orochimaru had spent years developing. This relationship became particularly important because Kabuto was not simply a subordinate. He became a researcher in his own right. Orochimaru taught him enormous amounts about medicine and biology, while Kabuto expanded upon that knowledge and eventually developed his own experiments. Their partnership demonstrated how Orochimaru's research could spread beyond himself, creating new scientists who were capable of continuing the work even if Orochimaru was absent. That became especially important after Sasuke defeated him. Although Orochimaru's body was destroyed, his research survived through the information and biological material he had accumulated. His experiments had become so extensive that killing the researcher did not necessarily eliminate the research itself. The laboratories remained. The samples remained. The techniques remained. And the people who had learned from him remained. This was perhaps the most dangerous achievement of Orochimaru's experiments. He had created a system capable of preserving his knowledge even when he himself was temporarily defeated. Over the years, that system produced increasingly unusual results, from artificial organisms to genetically modified shinobi and experimental vessels. Every discovery brought Orochimaru closer to his original objective of transcending the limitations of ordinary human existence. Yet, there was another area of research that would prove even more significant. Orochimaru wanted to know whether the ultimate power of the human body could be reproduced artificially, even when that power came from something far beyond ordinary genetics. The answer would eventually lead him toward the study of Jinchuriki, tailed beasts, and the extraordinary chakra that existed inside them. And once Orochimaru began investigating that power, the boundaries of his experiments became even more extreme. Orochimaru's experiments eventually expanded beyond ordinary genetics, because he realized that some of the greatest sources of power in the shinobi world did not originate from human bloodlines at all. The tailed beasts represented something fundamentally different. Beings composed almost entirely of immense chakra, whose abilities could overwhelm entire armies. If Orochimaru could understand how their chakra interacted with human bodies, he might discover another way to overcome the limitations that had defined his research from the beginning. His interest in Jinchuriki therefore followed naturally from his earlier experiments. A Jinchuriki was a human being who carried a tailed beast inside their body, creating a relationship between two completely different forms of life. The process was extremely dangerous because the host had to survive the enormous chakra of the beast while maintaining enough control to prevent it from taking over. To Orochimaru, this represented a fascinating biological problem. If a human body could contain something as powerful as a tailed beast, perhaps the limits of the body were much greater than ordinary shinobi believed. Orochimaru was particularly interested in what happened when the balance failed. Jinchuriki, who lost control, could undergo dramatic physical transformations as the beast's chakra overwhelmed their own. Their bodies became stronger, faster, and more resilient, but the transformation came with enormous risks. Orochimaru wanted to understand whether these changes could be controlled, reproduced, or applied to other subjects without requiring an actual tailed beast. This research connected closely with his previous work. The curse mark had already shown him that foreign power could be introduced into a human body and trigger physical transformation. Hashirama's cells had demonstrated that foreign biological material could potentially alter a person's abilities. Jinchuriki represented another version of the same problem, except on a vastly greater scale. If Orochimaru could understand the process, he could potentially create humans capable of surviving powers that should have been impossible for them to contain. His interest in the Nine Tails became particularly significant because the beast was connected directly to Naruto Uzumaki, one of the most unusual children in Konoha. Naruto's ability to survive the Nine Tails chakra made him an intriguing subject. Although Orochimaru never gained the same direct access to Naruto that he had to some of his other targets. Instead, Orochimaru continued observing the phenomenon from a distance, while focusing on other methods of manipulating human bodies. One of the most important examples came from his research into Sasuke and the Sharingan. Orochimaru understood that the Uchiha's eyes represented a form of power that evolved through intense psychological and biological processes. The Sharingan was not simply an organ that could be copied mechanically. Its development was connected to the emotions and chakra of its user, meaning that Orochimaru was dealing with an ability in which biology, chakra, and psychology were deeply interconnected. This made the Uchiha especially valuable for his research. The same principle applied to the tailed beasts. Their chakra could not simply be treated as an ordinary substance because it influenced the physical and mental state of the host. Orochimaru therefore became increasingly interested in the relationship between chakra and identity, asking whether a person's body could remain stable while containing an entirely foreign source of power. These questions also influenced his research into artificial bodies. If a natural human body could not safely contain certain abilities, perhaps a modified body could. This was one reason Orochimaru continued developing clones, altered organisms, and experimental vessels. Each successful creation provided another opportunity to test how much power a body could tolerate. The ultimate goal was not necessarily to recreate a tailed beast itself, but to discover the biological conditions required for a human being to survive extraordinary chakra. The results of these experiments were inconsistent. Some subjects died. Others survived, but suffered permanent physical changes. Some gained unusual abilities, but could not control them. And a small number demonstrated that Orochimaru's theories were correct. The pattern repeated throughout his research. He would identify an ability, find a way to reproduce part of it, introduce the resulting modification into a subject, and then observe the consequences. Every successful experiment encouraged him to push the process further, while every failure taught him what the human body could not yet withstand. This philosophy also explains why Orochimaru was fascinated by Jugo. Jugo's body naturally absorbed natural energy from the environment, something that most shinobi could only accomplish through specialized training. His body could transform itself almost instinctively, but the process was difficult to control and could cause extreme changes in his behavior. Orochimaru recognized that Jugo's body was essentially a natural laboratory. Rather than simply studying him, Orochimaru extracted what made his abilities possible and incorporated that knowledge into the curse mark. The resulting technique allowed other people to access some of the same power, although most subjects could not survive the process. This became one of Orochimaru's most successful examples of transferring a natural ability into another human being. The curse mark therefore connected several different areas of his research. It involved genetics, chakra manipulation, natural energy, physical transformation, and behavioral changes, all of which were subjects Orochimaru had already spent years studying separately. His experiments were gradually becoming interconnected. The goal was no longer to understand one technique or one bloodline. Orochimaru wanted to understand the fundamental rules governing the human body itself. If he could determine why one person survived an experiment while another died, he could potentially redesign the process. If he could identify the genetic or chakra characteristics responsible for survival, he could select better subjects. If he could create artificial bodies possessing those characteristics from the beginning, he might eventually eliminate the need for experimentation on ordinary humans. That idea would later become increasingly important. Orochimaru was beginning to move from modifying existing life toward creating life specifically suited to his purposes. But his fascination with tailed beasts also taught him something important. Power alone was not enough. The body had to be capable of controlling the power, and the mind had to remain stable enough to direct it. A perfect vessel, therefore, needed more than physical strength. It needed compatibility, adaptability, and the ability to maintain its identity while containing forces that could otherwise overwhelm it. This was precisely what Orochimaru had been searching for all along: a perfect vessel. The search for that vessel would eventually become the central purpose behind many of his most disturbing experiments, because every new discovery brought him closer to understanding what kind of body could withstand his consciousness permanently. Yet there was still one problem he had never completely solved. Even the strongest bodies could eventually deteriorate. Orochimaru needed a way to make his existence independent of ordinary biology altogether. And that meant pushing his research beyond the body itself, toward the nature of consciousness, identity, and the possibility of transferring one person's existence into another. By the later stages of Orochimaru's research, his experiments had moved beyond the simple question of how to strengthen a living body. He had already experimented with genetics, bloodline abilities, artificial organisms, cursed transformations, and the transfer of consciousness. Yet one problem remained impossible to ignore. Even if a body could be replaced, the knowledge of the dead still disappeared with them. Orochimaru had spent his entire life trying to overcome the limitations of mortality, and eventually his research turned toward one of the most forbidden techniques ever created: the reanimation jutsu. The technique had originally been developed by Hashirama Senju, the second Hokage, and allowed the dead to be summoned back into the world using living human sacrifices. Orochimaru became fascinated by the possibilities almost immediately after learning about it. Unlike his living corpse reincarnation, which was designed to preserve his own consciousness, reanimation offered something completely different. It could bring other people back. For Orochimaru, this meant that death no longer had to be the final boundary separating him from the knowledge of the past. If the bodies and souls of dead shinobi could be recovered, then the greatest warriors in history could potentially be studied, questioned, and even forced to fight again. Their techniques would no longer exist only in old records, because the people who had mastered them could literally be returned to the battlefield. But reanimation required experimentation. The technique was extraordinarily difficult, and Orochimaru needed living sacrifices to serve as vessels for the dead. This created another horrifying problem, because every successful resurrection required the life of another person. Orochimaru therefore began searching for ways to improve the process, making the resurrected bodies more stable and reducing the limitations that initially prevented them from acting like the original individuals. His research eventually attracted Kabuto Yakushi. Kabuto had originally served as a medical shinobi and intelligence specialist, but after becoming Orochimaru's assistant, he gained access to knowledge that few people in the world possessed. Orochimaru taught Kabuto about anatomy, genetics, chakra, bloodline abilities, and the various experiments taking place inside his laboratories. Kabuto learned quickly. Eventually, he became capable of continuing much of Orochimaru's research independently, and his abilities became so advanced that he was able to improve techniques that Orochimaru himself had never perfected. Their partnership therefore became more than that of master and student. Kabuto became the person capable of taking Orochimaru's research and pushing it into entirely new territory. This became clear after Sasuke defeated Orochimaru. Orochimaru's physical body was destroyed, but his research remained. Kabuto had absorbed Orochimaru's biological material and continued experimenting on himself, incorporating traits from his former master's research as well as genetic characteristics obtained from other powerful shinobi. His body gradually became a collection of abilities derived from multiple sources, demonstrating just how far Orochimaru's philosophy could spread when placed in the hands of another researcher. Kabuto eventually perfected his own version of the reanimation jutsu. During the Fourth Great Ninja War, he resurrected numerous legendary shinobi, including several former Kage and members of the Akatsuki. Each resurrection demonstrated the terrifying potential of Orochimaru's original research because the dead could return with their techniques, memories, and combat abilities largely intact. The war, therefore, became, in part, a demonstration of what Orochimaru had spent decades trying to accomplish. The dead could be preserved. Their abilities could be reproduced. Their bodies could be manipulated. Their knowledge could be recovered. The boundary between life and death had been weakened. Yet Kabuto's actions also demonstrated one of the greatest dangers of Orochimaru's philosophy. Knowledge could be preserved without preserving the individual. The resurrected shinobi were forced to fight against their will, their bodies controlled by another person for military purposes. This was exactly the kind of outcome Orochimaru's research made possible. The reanimation jutsu also revealed how much Orochimaru had underestimated the importance of identity. Orochimaru had spent years believing that a person's body could be replaced without fundamentally changing who they were. But the resurrected shinobi demonstrated that memory, emotion, and personal will remained powerful even after death. Some of the reanimated warriors resisted their control. Others regained enough awareness to understand what was happening. The technique could control their bodies, but it could not completely erase everything that made them who they were. This became especially important when Orochimaru himself was eventually restored. After Sasuke learned the truth about the village and began searching for answers, he used Anko's curse mark and Orochimaru's remaining chakra to bring him back. Orochimaru returned not as the same unstoppable villain who had once attacked Konoha, but as someone who had gained an entirely different perspective after observing Sasuke's actions and the events surrounding the war. His return demonstrated just how difficult it was to permanently destroy him. Orochimaru had created so many methods of preserving his consciousness that even when his body disappeared, pieces of his existence remained within his experiments. His curse, marks, biological material, techniques, and followers had effectively become extensions of himself. The human experimentation had therefore achieved something he had always wanted. Orochimaru had made his existence difficult to erase. But the Fourth Great Ninja War also revealed the ultimate contradiction within his research. He had spent decades trying to escape death, yet he had created countless deaths in the process. He had wanted to preserve knowledge, yet he had repeatedly destroyed human lives to acquire it. He had wanted to understand what made people unique, yet his experiments often reduced those people to collections of useful traits. And still, Orochimaru continued. After the war, his research became less openly destructive, but his curiosity never disappeared. He remained fascinated by biology, artificial life, genetic abilities, and the possibilities of modifying living organisms. The experiments that had once been driven almost entirely by fear of death gradually became something closer to pure scientific curiosity. His later work with artificial humans demonstrated this evolution. Mitsuki, one of the most significant products of Orochimaru's research, represented a very different kind of experiment. Rather than simply modifying an unwilling human subject, Orochimaru created a person intentionally and allowed him to develop his own identity. Mitsuki possessed extraordinary abilities, including the capacity to use Sage Mode. Yet he was not created merely as a disposable test subject. This suggested that Orochimaru's philosophy had changed. Perhaps he had finally begun to understand that creating life was different from controlling it. The man who had once treated human beings as experiments had eventually created a child and allowed that child to choose his own path. Yet the history of Orochimaru's experiments could never be separated from the countless lives affected by his earlier work. His laboratories had produced discoveries that influenced by the end of Orochimaru's story. The experiments that had once seemed like isolated acts of cruelty revealed themselves as pieces of a much larger obsession. From the moment he began questioning death as a child, Orochimaru had pursued one central idea: that the limitations placed upon human beings were not necessarily permanent. Aging, disease, genetic inheritance, physical weakness, and even death itself appeared to him as problems that could be solved through enough knowledge. The problem was the price he was willing to pay for that knowledge. For decades, Orochimaru treated human beings as experimental material, sacrificing their bodies in order to answer questions that conventional shinobi science could not. His laboratories became places where the boundaries between medicine, ninjutsu, and biological experimentation disappeared completely. The experiments involving Hashirama's cells demonstrated that powerful bloodline abilities could potentially be transferred into another body, while the curse mark proved that the physical characteristics of one individual could be extracted and imposed upon others. His research into the Sharingan showed his obsession with bloodlines, while his work with Jugo provided a way to reproduce the effects of natural energy in other people. His experiments with artificial organisms eventually demonstrated that life itself could be created and shaped according to specific designs, while his work with reanimation proved that even death could be temporarily overcome through forbidden techniques. Each discovery answered one question, and each answer created another. That was the defining characteristic of Orochimaru's research. He never reached a point where he could simply stop and say that he had learned enough. If he discovered how one body worked, he wanted to understand another. If he acquired one bloodline ability, he became interested in another. If he discovered a way to extend his life, he immediately began searching for a method that would make that extension more reliable. His experiments, therefore, became endless. The most infamous example remained his research involving Hashirama Senju's cells. 100 children were subjected to the experiment, and 99 died before Orochimaru abandoned the project. Only Yamato survived, proving that wood release could be reproduced in another individual under extraordinarily rare circumstances. The result was scientifically remarkable and morally horrifying. Orochimaru had obtained exactly what he wanted: proof that a legendary bloodline ability could be transferred to another human being. But the price had been 99 lives, and that contradiction summarized almost everything wrong with his philosophy. To Orochimaru, the experiment had succeeded. To everyone else, 99 children had died. That difference in perspective followed him throughout his entire life. His experiments with Sasuke were different in method, but similar in principle. Orochimaru recognized the young Uchiha as a potential vessel and manipulated him into seeking greater power, all while secretly planning to take control of his body. Sasuke eventually resisted, but the fact that Orochimaru could look at a traumatized teenager and primarily see a future vessel demonstrated how completely his obsession had changed the way he viewed other people. Yet Sasuke's resistance also exposed a weakness in Orochimaru's philosophy. People were not simply bodies. They possessed wills. They could change. They could reject the purposes others had designed for them. This lesson became increasingly important after the Fourth Great Ninja War. Orochimaru returned to the world having witnessed the consequences of his own research: the resurrection of the dead, the destruction caused by the war, and the unpredictable decisions of people such as Sasuke. He was still Orochimaru. His curiosity had not disappeared, but something about his approach had changed. The clearest evidence was Mitsuki. Unlike the unwilling children Orochimaru had experimented on in the past, Mitsuki was deliberately created as a living person. Orochimaru designed his body with extraordinary capabilities, including the potential to access Sage Mode. But he did not simply keep Mitsuki as a laboratory subject. Instead, he allowed him to develop his own identity and eventually leave the laboratory to discover what kind of person he wanted to become. This was an enormous departure from the Orochimaru of the past. The man who had once believed that people existed primarily as sources of useful information had created a life and allowed that life to possess freedom. Mitsuki, therefore, represented more than another successful experiment. He represented a change in Orochimaru's understanding of what experimentation could mean. Orochimaru still wanted knowledge, but he no longer seemed to require the destruction of others to obtain it. His later research became less focused on conquering death and more focused on understanding how life could be created, developed, and guided. He remained morally strange and continued conducting experiments, but the complete disregard for human life that had defined his earlier years appeared to have diminished. Even so, the consequences of his past could never simply disappear. Yamato continued living with the abilities forced into his body. Anko carried the curse mark that Orochimaru had implanted in her. Sasuke's relationship with Orochimaru permanently shaped his development. Kabuto inherited his research and nearly turned it into a weapon capable of overwhelming the entire shinobi world. Countless unnamed subjects never survived long enough to leave behind names or stories. Their lives became statistics in Orochimaru's research, and that may be the darkest part of his history. Orochimaru did not begin his journey as someone who wanted to hurt people. He began as someone who hated losing them. His parents died, and he became fascinated with mortality. The wars showed him how much knowledge disappeared whenever people died. His desire to preserve that knowledge eventually became a desire to live forever. And that desire eventually became an obsession with controlling the human body. At every stage, his original motivation remained buried somewhere beneath the experiments. He wanted more time. He wanted more knowledge. He wanted to see what humanity could eventually become. But somewhere along the way, he stopped asking whether the people he experimented on had the same right to that future. That was the tragedy of Orochimaru. His intelligence was genuine. His discoveries were extraordinary. Some of his research ultimately contributed to techniques and knowledge that benefited the shinobi world, even though those discoveries were born from methods that could never be justified simply because the results were useful. Orochimaru demonstrated how scientific curiosity can become dangerous when there are no ethical boundaries strong enough to restrain it. He also demonstrated that knowledge itself is not automatically good or evil. What matters is what someone is willing to sacrifice to obtain it. For most of his life, Orochimaru believed that there was no experiment too cruel, no body too valuable to manipulate, and no forbidden technique too dangerous to study if the result brought him closer to understanding the secrets of existence. Eventually, however, he began to realize that the greatest mystery was not how to defeat death. It was understanding why life mattered in the first place. The laboratories, the curse marks, the stolen bloodlines, the artificial bodies, the resurrected dead, and the countless failed experiments all belonged to the same long journey. They were attempts by one man to overcome the boundaries of human existence. And although Orochimaru never truly stopped being an experimenter, the end of his story suggests that he finally began to understand something he had ignored for most of his life. A human being is not simply a body. A person cannot be reduced to their bloodline, their chakra, their abilities, or their usefulness. And perhaps the most important discovery Orochimaru ever made was that creating life means very little if you refuse to respect the life you have created. His experiments changed the shinobi world forever, leaving behind techniques, discoveries, survivors, and consequences that continued long after individual laboratories had been abandoned. The man who once wanted to conquer death ultimately achieved something stranger. He survived long enough to see his philosophy change. And in a world where almost every great shinobi was eventually consumed by the battles they fought, Orochimaru remained alive, still searching, still experimenting. and still trying to understand the mystery that had haunted him since childhood. What it truly means to live.